Salve Empire Builders, today we are discussing the 7 levels of Roman emperors. So far we've covered the 7 levels of empire, the 7 levels of empire builders. Today we're focusing on the first 70 or so emperors from Augustus to Romulus Augustulus. Now you know the drill, this list is not exhaustive and it's not covering the Byzantine emperors, but don't worry, you know this channel's stance on the Byzantine Empire. We prefer to call it the New Roman Empire around these parts, but we'll save the Byzantine emperors, another 70 or so, for a future video. Trust me, we have enough to cover in this video alone. We're going to have Rome's femboy emperor, Rome's fattest emperor, its 7-foot tall emperor, the nutcases, of course, Nero, Caligula. We'll find out about the true extent of their madness, some of the crazy things you might not even have realized that they got up to. We'll touch on some underrated emperors, some overrated emperors, stoic bros, beware, and we'll wrap it all up with the 3 great emperors among the 5 good emperors, as well as the 2 emperors that I think are the most important in that entire stretch of history from the 1st century to the 5th. Okay, with that said, let's jump right in. But I have just one favor to ask of you guys if you want to see more content like this, and that is to like and subscribe if you haven't already, and also to hit that bell because subscriptions are pretty useless otherwise these days. First up, we got the calamities, the national embarrassments, the mad, the bad, the fat, the ugly. A few of them are infamous to this day for their cruelty or their madness, and it is a testament to the Roman state that it survived them. First up, we got Caligula. His actual name was Gaius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, so he was named after some pretty impressive figures. But he was nicknamed Caligula, or Little Boot, because he would accompany his father on campaign as a child. Now, Caligula only ruled for 4 years, but he obviously made quite an impression during that time. He's supposed to have begun his reign as a just and generous and kind ruler. He was liked, if not adored, by the Roman public, but he did overspend and he antagonized the Roman Senate, and members of the Roman senatorial class were obviously disproportionately writing the histories of Rome, so that didn't bode well for Caligula's historical record. Per Suetonius, to make a long story short, vast sums of money, including the 2.7 billion sesterces which Tiberius Caesar had amassed, were squandered by him, meaning Caligula, in less than the revolution of a year. But on the whole, we know surprisingly little about Caligula's reign. Like Cassius Dio, Suetonius was much more interested in the man, or the monster I should say, than the emperor. We all know the story about Caligula making his horse a consul, but contrary to what people might think about what this indicates about his sanity, it might have been sort of like a humiliation ritual for the senatorial class, simply showing the Roman body politique that the office of consul was not what it once was, that it was effectively useless in the age of the Principate, the age of the emperors. And it's important to remember that the rules were still being written in real time. The Principate was only on its 3rd emperor by the time of Caligula. There was Augustus, Tiberius, and then Caligula, so he came very early in the story of the Roman Empire. So really what Caligula was doing was laying bare the Augustan reality. Not smart, but not necessarily insane either. And you might read some of the other stories in circulation about Caligula in the same spirit of humiliation ritual and demeaning the Senate and showing the Roman world where the power really lay. One story that comes to mind takes place at a dinner party. Caligula had slept with a senator's wife, something which Julius Caesar did all the time, but unlike Caesar, who kept it on the down low, Caligula then goes to this same senator and tells him that he was disappointed with his wife's performance in bed, and everybody around him hears this, of course. Besides that, Caligula is also accused of having incestuous relations with his sisters. This very much fits into his reputation as having boundless appetites, sexual and otherwise, but this claim in particular is quite dubious. Even the Roman historians reporting on this are pretty skeptical themselves. Some believe it, some don't. Ultimately, though, I would take that one with a grain of salt in the same way that I would take the allegations about the Borgias with a grain of salt as well. In the end, Caligula was assassinated by the Praetorian Guard, beginning a long tradition of Praetorian treachery. Again, he was only the third emperor and already he's being assassinated by the Praetorians, but you can kind of see why that took place. And because of how early this was in the history of the empire, because of the lengths that Caligula went to humiliate the senatorial class, in the wake of his death, there was even talk of restoring the the Roman Republic. Now, in reality, this was a moot point. The Republic was not coming back, but it's safe to say that Caligula really rocked the boat. And who better to follow Caligula than Nero? Nero is the son of Caligula's sister, the author of an autobiography. Obviously, that would have shed plenty of light on the psychology of both Caligula and Nero alike, but tragically this autobiography has been lost. In any case, we do know what Nero does with his mother. He kills her, and I think on that basis it's pretty safe to assume that he was a little insane, especially because he also killed his stepbrother and wife on top of that. Now, Nero ruled much longer than Caligula, for 14 years, and he scandalized the Roman elite, less so by outright humiliating them, and more so by demeaning himself and appearing in public as an actor, an artist, a charioteer, and consorting freely with the unwashed masses, a fact which made him very popular among the everyday Romans to an even greater extent than Caligula. And perhaps because of this popularity, there spawned an undying Nero legend in the East, this idea that Nero would rise from the dead, as was later said of Charlemagne and Frederick II. The early Christians ran with this myth and distorted it too by making Nero out to be the Antichrist. Nero may or may not have caused the Great Fire of Rome, but he certainly wasn't playing the fiddle because it wasn't invented yet. He might have been playing the lyre though, based on his predilection with music. He accused the Christians of starting the fire and rounded them up and began mass executions, no doubt sparking those Antichrist allegations. But in reality, Rome, with its sprawling tenements, had no shortage of fire hazards. It's just that Nero might have let it happen in order to make room for his Domus Aurea, his golden house. And a fun fact for you, this golden house was later torn down to make room for the Colosseum. So no Nero, no Colosseum, because how else would the emperor responsible for demolishing the golden house and then building the Colosseum in its place be able to justify such a big public expense? Surprisingly, Nero was not assassinated, but he probably feared he would be. He took his own life after being declared a public enemy by the Senate, and his last words are some of the most memorable in all of history. He proclaimed, "What an artist the world is losing." But there's actually one other thing he said on top of that. As someone was trying to stop the bleeding from his stab wound, he said, "Too late, this is fidelity." Nero's death led to the end of the Julio-Claudian dynasty and the year of the four emperors, the empire's first crisis. Next up is the guy that Joaquin Phoenix plays in Gladiator, Commodus, the man, the myth, the wannabe legend. He was also mad and bad like Joaquin Phoenix's depiction, but I imagine in real life he was mad and bad in a bit of a different way. I imagine him as having more physicality. He believed himself the reincarnation of Hercules, but in the great continuum between based and cringe, it's safe to say that he fell on the cringe side, just like Karla did, and most unlike Alexander and his own attempts to LARP as Hercules, but especially Achilles. Commodus fought in the Colosseum as a secutor, providing ample fodder for those who believed that he was actually fathered by a gladiator, not Marcus Aurelius. The wife of Marcus Aurelius, unlike the wife of Caesar, was not above suspicion, so this was probably juicy gossip at the time. But yeah, Commodus was the kid who had it all. He was the prodigal son of the philosopher emperor of Rome. Despite that, he had very little interest in ruling for the 15 or so years that he did rule. I mean, as an illustration of this, we can just take the last month of his life, November, when he spent every morning pelting hundreds of animals in the Colosseum with javelins and arrows, and then spending the afternoons fighting gladiators and rigging every match so that he would come out the victor, of course. And at some point, while this was happening, Commodus's mistress found a hit list in his quarters that included her name and a bunch of other people, so she began scheming with these people. They poison Commodus, he throws up his food, and thereby survives, so they then send his wrestling partner Narcissus to strangle him in the bath, and so ended the life of Commodus. It was also the end of the Nerva Antonine dynasty and the start of the year of 5 emperors, and not the good kind. Lastly, we have Elagabalus, the femboy emperor. He ruled from 14 to 18, and throughout his reign, he was basically puppeted by his grandmother, a formidable woman named Julia Maesa. Interestingly, there are museums around today that refer to Elagabalus as a she instead of a he, and in this, they're really following the emperor's example because he referred to himself as a she, he dressed as a woman, and he also preferred the title empress instead of emperor. The word on the street was that the emperor prostituted himself, had several husbands, and would hire court officials based on the size of their Most shockingly, he inquired about what we today would call gender reaffirming surgery. We can quote from Cassius Dio. He carried his lewdness to such a point that he asked the physicians to contrive a woman's vagina in his body by means of an incision, promising them large sums for doing so. Elagabalus also threw some wild dinner parties. At one, a bunch of guests were smothered with roses, apparently. There's an amazing painting that attempts to depict this. And at another dinner party, 600 ostrich brains were served. Perhaps most damningly, however, Elagabalus made a mockery of Roman religion. This is because his mother's side of the family descended from Syrian priests and priestesses devoted to the sun god Elagabal, hence his name, Elagabalus. Now, stay with me here. The Greek equivalent of Elagabal would be Helios, and the Roman equivalent would be Sol Invictus. But again, you might know where I'm going with this. It was based when Aurelian worshipped the sun. It was cringe when Elagabalus did it. And honestly, I don't think it's too hard to see why. Roman attitudes about sexuality were pretty liberal, at least compared to the Middle Ages, but they still had this concept of active versus passive, and Roman society most likely did see Elagabalus as effeminate and weak and not worthy of being an emperor, judging from who ended up being emperor next, and we're going to get to that pretty soon. I think you could also make the case that the unfavorable perception of Elagabalus is what ultimately doomed Severus Alexander, his cousin and successor, who was basically seen as also too weak and effeminate and a total mama's boy, and was therefore assassinated alongside with his mother quite tragically, despite showing some promise and some aptitude toward ruling. And ultimately, this led to the end of the Severan dynasty and the crisis of the 3rd century. Our dishonorable mention for this level is Vitellius, possibly the fattest emperor that Rome ever had, as evidenced by contemporary descriptions and those glorious double-chinned busts that there are so many of. I mean, his were some of the most sumptuous feasts in all of Roman history, which is really saying something given the competition. One source says, "It is said there were served up to no less than 2,000 choice fishes and 7,000 birds. At another feast, the livers of pike, the brains of pheasants and peacocks, with the tongues of flamingos and the entrails of lampreys, which had been brought in ships of war as far as from Parthia and the Spanish Straits." Vitellius was as jolly as he was fat, except to his son, I guess, who he had killed in order to claim his wife's inheritance all for himself. Anyways, the reason you might not have heard of Vitellius is because he only ruled for 8 months during the year of 4 emperors, the crisis set into motion by the death of Nero, and Vitellius would be overthrown by Vespasian after a very costly siege of Rome, which cost tens of thousands of lives. Vitellius himself was dragged out of his hidey hole in a doorkeeper's lodge and killed, his last words being, "Yet I was once your emperor." And his body was then flung into the Tiber in an age-old Roman tradition. Our next level is the Blunderers. Not even the complex machinery of the Roman state could keep up with their incompetence. They left the empire worse off, and there's quite a few to get through in this level, so we're going to go through them pretty fast. First up, we have P. Didius Julianus, who bought the Roman throne on auction from the Praetorian Guard, who had just assassinated Pertinax. Didius barely lasted 2 months before he was overthrown by Septimius Severus, who brought the year of 5 emperors to an end in doing so. Didius's blunder, just the horrible precedent of buying the throne on auction. Obviously, this undermined the legitimacy of the Principate, and the only thing he did during his reign was devalue the currency, just another step in the long road to hyperinflation, which would really take off during the crisis years. Our next entry didn't last very long either. His name was Maximinus Thrax, and he was the very picture of all bronze, no brains. Seriously, just listen to this source description. In a single day, he drank a Capitoline amphora of wine and ate 40 pounds of meat, or according to Cordus, no less than 60. It seems sufficiently agreed, too, that he abstained wholly from vegetables, and almost always from anything cold, save when he had to drink. Often he would catch his sweat, and put it in cups or a small jar, and he could exhibit by this means 2 or 3 pints of it. He was of such size that men said he was 6 inches over 8 feet in height, and his thumb was so huge that he used his wife's bracelet for a ring. Other stories are reported, almost as common talk, that he could drag wagons with his hands and move a laden cart by himself, that if he struck a horse with his fist, he loosened its teeth, or with its heel broke its legs, that he could crumble tufaceous stone and split saplings, and that he was called Hercules. So another Hercules LARPer, and perhaps the truest of form, physically at least. Obviously, this is a hugely exaggerated physical description, but it probably preserved a kernel of truth. Maximinus Thrax probably was a big and strong guy. And if you were to conjure up the image of the very antithesis, the very foil to his Severan predecessors, the femboy Elagabalus, the mama's boy Severus Alexander, you probably would conjure up the image of Maximinus Thrax, which is why he followed them, which is why his men acclaimed him emperor. But the reality was this barracks emperor had no business holding the imperial office. He was quickly opposed by the Senate. This led to the year of 6 emperors. He died that same year. He was assassinated just like his predecessors, and his death would doom the empire to another 46 years of hyperinflation, civil war, and disintegration. Next on our list is Valerian, not a Targaryen dragon, a Roman emperor, another crisis of the 3rd century emperor. He was also the first emperor to be captured in battle. Super humiliating, especially given these stories about molten gold being poured down his gullet, about him being used as a human footstool. And just imagine your captivity being immortalized in bas relief. I mean, ouch. There's also Valens, the loser of the Battle of Adrianople. This is traditionally considered the beginning of the end of the Roman Empire, even though the battle took place in the east, and that is because the Goths were now a player. They weren't going away anytime soon. They would also serve as an example to other barbarian peoples that maybe the Roman Empire could be contended with and humiliated on the field of battle. Maybe the legions weren't so invincible anymore. Besides that, Valens' reign was one of fear, paranoia, and Stalinist, or maybe I should just say Augustan witch hunts. Again, Augustus's prescriptions were a different matter, but I'm done with that meme. Gibbon wrote that an anxious regard to his personal safety was the ruling principle of the administration of Valens. But ironically, this fearful, safety-obsessed emperor would be one of the few emperors to die in battle. He would die in the Battle of Adrianople. Then there's Honorius, an idiot of the 1st degree, who somehow held on to power for 30 years. Usually, bad rulers don't last this long in the Roman Empire and elsewhere, but somehow the self-correcting mechanism of Rome's assassinations, civil wars, and coups didn't work their magic on Honorius, and that's probably because nobody wanted the job at this point. Honorius's big blunder was that he signed off on the death of Stilicho, his ablest general by far, and only 2 years later, this led to the sack of Rome by the Visigoths. And here's the kicker, according to Procopius. At that time, at the time of the sack, they say that the Emperor Honorius in Ravenna received the message from one of the eunuchs, evidently a keeper of the poultry, that Rome had perished. And he cried out and said, "And yet it has just eaten from my hands," for he had a very large cock, a chicken, Rome by name, and the eunuch, comprehending his words, said that it was the city of Rome which had perished at the hands of Alaric. And the emperor, with a sigh of relief, answered quickly, "But I thought that my foul Rome had perished. So great, they say, was the folly with which this emperor was possessed." And even Edward Gibbon treats this story as apocryphal, but there's probably something to the idea that Honorius was, on the whole, pretty disinterested in ruling. And like with Elagabalus, I will say this story spawned an amazing art piece. Like Honorius, Valentinian III somehow defied the odds and ruled for 30 years despite not being very good at the job. In his case, he began his reign at age 6, making him the youngest sole emperor in Rome's history. He was the last emperor from Valentinian's line, and his big blunder was killing another top guy, Aetius, who was the winner of the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, the battle that we opened up our Burgundy series with. After Valentinian had Aetius killed, Aetius's bodyguards proceed to kill Valentinian, and so ended the line of Valentinian. By that point, North Africa, Western Spain, and much of Gaul had been overrun, so again, big blunder. Unlike his predecessor Valentinian, Petronius Maximus ruled barely a year, and he let the Vandal sack of Rome occur and was lynched during his escape from the city, his corpse thrown into the Tiber, in that long tradition going back to Vitellius and even further back than that. The sack also gave us the word vandalism. Pope Leo is supposed to have tamped down on the violence by pleading with the Vandals, but they still ended up killing a bunch of citizens, enslaving many others, including the Empress and her daughters, and then shipping them all to Africa and destroying many priceless works of art in the process. Our dishonorable mention for this level is Karla, an inveterate Alexander LARPer, an unsuccessful one unlike Caesar because he blundered away the Parthian campaign. Karla was suspected of killing his father. He probably didn't really do that, but he certainly killed his brother Geta, and in front of their mother too. The brothers' hatred for one another almost made them ahead of their time. They almost ended up splitting the empire right at the Bosphorus, but Karla just ended up killing Geta instead. He was also behind the baths of Karla, Rome's second biggest bath complex, and of course the Edict of Karla, which has somewhat of a mixed legacy. This was the single largest citizenship grant in history. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, you had 30 million new Roman citizens. This obviously got rid of the incentive mechanism whereby you joined the legions to get citizenship. It also created a new class divide. No longer was it Roman versus non-Roman or citizen versus non-citizen, but instead anestiores versus humiliores. As for the real incentive behind the citizenship grant, there's a lot of speculation because obviously Karla was not the type of guy to do this out of the goodness of his heart as some sort of grand gesture like a Marcus Aurelius might. So Cassius Dio famously suggested that the real reason was collecting more tax revenue, but the math doesn't quite add up on that. So instead, the reason might be religious in nature. It has been suggested that Karla wanted more citizens and their gods incorporated into Rome. That way he would have more sacrifices made on his behalf and he would curry favor with the gods that way. Next up are the Benchwarmers, and I freely admit that I struggled with this level a little bit. I stuck in the literally who emperors in this one, the nobodies that you've never heard of unless you're a massive Roman history buff, as well as a couple emperors that I think were pretty good, all things considered. It's just that their one blind spot was reputation management, senatorial relations, which was very important for earning your place in the historical record and making sure that you were remembered as a good emperor. And the two emperors that I'm talking about are the two remaining Julio-Claudians. Not Augustus, not Nero, not Caligula, but Tiberius and Claudius. So before Tiberius was even emperor, he had a highly successful career. He was a talented general as well as administrator. He secured the empire's northern border. He was considered the best general of his age. He helped Augustus negotiate with the Parthians to get back the standards that were lost during Crassus's time. And he was also a good administrator, being entrusted with managing the grain dole and with various other administrative matters in Italy. Now, his reputation was that of the reluctant ruler. Pliny the Elder called him the gloomiest of men. He was probably embittered by being forced by Augustus to divorce the love of his life and forced instead to marry her stepmother, and then also embittered by the death of his nephew and his son. At that point, he designated his nephew Caligula as his heir, who proceeded to blow through his budget surplus as emperor, as we've covered already. And I'm repeating myself, but again, Tiberius's blind spot was public relations, not just with the Senate, arguably, also with the general public. He was paranoid, he was over-serious, he was a shut-in. This is his reputation, and his reputation also became that of an old lecher because he basically shut himself up on the island of Capri, and this becomes the Roman equivalent of Epstein Island. Tiberius's reputation never truly recovers from this. As for Claudius, the story of his accession is also very emblematic of the reluctant ruler. He is found hiding behind a curtain by the Praetorian Guard, who had just assassinated his predecessor, Caligula. And it's easy to see why Claudius was a reluctant ruler and why he may have had some trouble charming people to his side. He's supposed to have had a stutter. He's supposed to have been frail and weak and not really a charismatic figure, but still a capable one. He definitely had a clever side. He may have amplified his weaknesses in order to survive the den of vipers that he was reared in. He was literally the last adult male of the Julio-Claudian line at the time of his accession, which explains how he got the job in the first place. And before his death at the age of 63, it is said that he was assassinated by his own wife, although this is kind of a frequent accusation about the Julio-Claudians. It probably was just a natural death, but before his death, he accomplished a good deal. He proved a perfectly good administrator, a perfectly good builder. He even launched the conquest of Britain. He expanded Roman citizenship. But like for Tiberius, there's not really a place for Claudius higher on this list based on how I've structured the 7 levels. He was a good emperor. He just wasn't a good emperor. And since I think public relations is part of the job, I think that's a fairly defensible stance, but feel free to let me know otherwise in the comments. But yeah, as for the rest of this level, you can put any number of pretender claimants, any number of contenders from the year of 4, 5, 6 emperors, or from the crisis years, and all those names will now appear on screen. Go ahead and pat yourself on the back if you recognize at least 5 of them. Level 4 is the Patriarchs. All of these entries established dynasties, brought some crisis or another to an end, and all of them left the empire better off, despite some of them being real brutes and not caring about undermining the legitimacy of the Principate or following in the example of Augustus. They understood the raw reality of Roman power, and they weren't afraid to wield it. Our first entry is Vespasian, the founder of the Flavian dynasty. He was the winner of the year of 4 emperors, and his dynasty was the first after the Julio-Claudians. Vespasian finished up the conquest of Britain, even if Tacitus insists that his father-in-law Agricola deserves all the credit. Vespasian also greenlit the Flavian amphitheater, better known as the Colosseum, because of the demolition of the Golden House, like we discussed earlier. Vespasian expanded the empire, administered well, he restored stability in the political and financial spheres, and he even coined a famous Latin saying, pecunia non olet, money does not stink, after his reimposition of a urine tax on public toilets. Our next patriarch is Nerva, the founder of the Nerva Antonine dynasty, the inaugurator of the era of 5 good emperors, and there's not much to say about Nerva because he only ruled for about 2 years, not even 2 years in fact. He obviously wasn't a brute. He comes across as a mild and humane personality. He was concerned about the well-being of the lower classes and provided tax relief, land grants, that sort of thing. But arguably his greatest achievement was choosing Trajan as his successor, a pretty damn good choice. In fact, the best choice. Our next entry is Septimius Severus, the founder of the Severan dynasty. He was the winner of the year of 5 emperors. He was the father of the infamous Caracalla. And we're dealing with a well-traveled, well-seasoned general here. His campaigns took him from Babylon to Scotland. He humiliated the Parthians by sacking Ctesiphon. He secured that border as well as the northern border by securing Hadrian's Wall. He was an active and energetic, if not particularly innovative administrator, but Septimius Severus did have a legitimacy problem, hence mounting military expenditures. The army was the basis of his power, and also some monumental architecture in Leptis Magna, his birthplace, as well as in Rome with his triumphal arch. Edward Gibbon was not a big fan of Septimius. He wrote that posterity, who experienced the fatal effects of his maxims and example, justly considered him as the principal author of the decline of the Roman Empire. And as always, Gibbon is opinionated, but he has a point. Septimius Severus was a provincial, ruling after the secret of empire had been revealed, and arguably this made him a little bit of an alien in Rome. It probably served to cause even more of a wedge between him and the Senate, and this is another reason why he resorted to acting more like a military dictator and founding his power base on the military as opposed to the Senate and trying to appease them. He didn't really care about that as much as former emperors in the Principate period did. And I think this is best expressed through his deathbed advice to his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta. He told them, be good to each other, enrich the soldiers, and damn all the rest. and let's just say they took about 2/3 of that advice to heart. Next up, we got Valentinian I. He ruled the west. His brother Valens ruled the east. He is called the Great, and for good reason. Historian Michael Grant called him the last really impressive emperor Rome ever had. He goes on, Valentinian was a superb soldier and a conscientious worker, endowed with ferocious energy. He felt a strong duty to the state and, much more unusual, a strong duty to the poor. More unusual still, in the age in which he lived, he believed in tolerating differences of religious opinion. For all his faults, he would have been an outstanding man in any epoch. And yeah, that sums it up pretty well. This was the last Roman emperor to cross the Rhine into Germania. He built a lot of forts to secure the border. He promoted peace between Christians and non-Christians. He founded a bunch of schools. He appointed a health secretary to each of Rome's 14 districts. But when Grant says that he had a ferocious energy, he really means it. This was a ferocious guy with a ferocious temper, so legendary that it was said he fed his enemies to bears and also died of a stroke mid-shouting fit. So there you have it, Valentinian the Great. Theodosius, the founder of the Theodosian dynasty, was another great, although it's possible that he had a little bit of an embellished record because of the Christian sources writing about a very, very Christian emperor. Took his faith very seriously and very important to the future of Christianity. He was the last guy to rule a united empire, and his descendants would rule for the next 60 or so years. Definitely his most enduring legacy is establishing the Nicene Creed as the dominant Christian doctrine. Today, that is the bedrock of both Catholicism and the Eastern Orthodox Church. Besides that, Theodosius restored some degree of political normalcy after the Adrianople disaster. He reached a deal diplomatically with the Goths and brought the war to an end. And he also presided over something called the Theodosian Renaissance, when a bunch of buildings were made or remade in ancient classical style, especially in New Rome, that is to say, Constantinople. That brings us to our firefighters. These are the guys who saved the empire or briefly restored it. And who better to begin with than Aurelian, really a poster boy firefighter, the Restitur Orbis, the restorer of the world as far as the Romans were concerned. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about him because you all know Aurelian. He brought the empire back together after its trifold split. He brought the Gallic Empire back under Roman control, as well as the Palmyrene Empire back under Roman control as well. Fearing a possible sack of Rome, he also ordered the construction of the Aurelian Walls, which would really come in handy later. Yet before Aurelian, there was a guy called Claudius II, and also Claudius Gothicus, and he earned that nickname because of one of the most impressive Roman victories in the entire history of the empire, at the Battle of Naissus, where Aurelian served as his cavalry commander, and Claudius won a brilliant victory against the Goths. Gothicus isn't his only nickname, though. He was also called Germanicus Maximus because of his victory over the Alemanni, who had just crossed the Alps. He defeated them at the Battle of Lake Benicus. And being the powerhouse that he was, he then turned on the Gallic Empire, retook Hispania, and then left Aurelian to finish up the job. So he set him up quite nicely for the conquest of the Gallic Empire, or reconquest of those provinces. And this was all in the span of just 2 years before his death in the plague of Cyprian, probably smallpox or measles, and a horrible outbreak that was costing like 5,000 lives in Rome at the time. So Claudius Gothic is a really impressive, underrated figure, definitely a firefighter. But our next entry is probably one you've heard of. This is our cabbage-loving Tetrarch Emperor Diocletian, who single-handedly ended the crisis of the 3rd century and then proceeded to do what no emperor had ever done: share power and then give it up. Like for Tiberius and Claudius, you could make the case that Diocletian deserves a place higher on this list. We'll get to why he does not rank higher shortly. But yeah, between the barbarians pouring in on the west, the Sassanids pushing up on the east, Diocletian realized that the empire was too big for one man to rule, hence the rule by 4, the Tetrarchy, which wouldn't outlast him, but which did more or less lead to the emergence of the Eastern Roman Empire as a distinct geopolitical entity that would far outlive the survival of the Western Roman Empire. And Diocletian really strikes me as the FDR of the Roman Empire. He comes to power at a late stage. He's remarkably even-keeled, level-headed, despite the chaos all around him. Just like FDR with the New Deal, he is trying stuff nonstop. And some of it's going to work, some of it's not, but ultimately he's going to help the empire survive that much longer. So Diocletian split the civil and military powers. He expanded the bureaucracy. His would be the most bureaucratic form of Roman government to date. He revamped the provincial system. He doubled the provinces from about 50 to 100, and then split each province up into 12 dioceses. He did spend a lot on building projects and mounting military expenditures, and for this reason he enacts various tax reforms with a bit of success, and then currency reforms definitely with less success. And lastly, he kind of does away with the pretenses of the Principate. Traditionally, the Roman Empire is divided into the Principate and Dominate periods, and it is Diocletian who brings about the Dominate period, even if I think historians have some issues, some gripes with that kind of division nowadays. What is true is that Diocletian, to a greater extent than his predecessors, embraces autocracy, monumental architecture, deification, this kind of thing. You know, he is the emperor. He is not just a princeps. He's not a first citizen. He's not first among equals, and he's not pretending to be. But that being said, in an almost inhuman twist, he gives it all up. So, unlike FDR, who dies in office, Diocletian, after a reign of 21 years, retires to his cabbage farm. And he sees the tetrarchy crumble before his eyes. He outlives it, and they beg him to come back, and this is his response. If you could show the cabbage that I planted with my own hands to your emperor, he definitely wouldn't dare suggest that I replace the peace and happiness of this place with the storms of a never-satisfied greed. And yeah, that made Diocletian the first emperor in Roman history to give power up voluntarily. Last but not least is Majorian, the Roman emperor in the west for 4 years. As the empire is crumbling all around him, he manages to reconquer Gaul and Hispania. He is about to take North Africa, but he is stopped by treachery. Majorian came up under Aetius, whose fate he more or less shared. This is another capable man during the waning years of the Roman Empire who is taken too soon because of treachery. He enacts various financial reforms, military reforms, he fights corruption, and because of this, the barbarian generalissimo Ricimer has Majorian killed. To Procopius, Majorian surpassed in every virtue all who have ever been emperors of the Romans. To Gibbon, Majorian presents the welcome discovery of a great and heroic character, such as sometimes arises in a degenerate age, to vindicate the honor of the human species, and even to the much more sober Encyclopedia Britannica, Majorian was the only emperor in the 5th century who had some claim to greatness. We now arrive at level 6, the Imperialists. Every entry in this level expands or administers the empire like they were born to do it. And this level consists of the 3 great emperors among the 5 good emperors, beginning with Trajan, the Conqueror. Trajan expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, quite famously, almost 2 million square miles, accounting for up to 25% of the world's population, with the empire's 60 million inhabitants. He annexed Dacia, Nabatea, Armenia, Mesopotamia, and Assyria, although a couple of these were temporary conquests. He was given the title Optimates, meaning the best, and by the 4th century, senators were already acclaiming emperors by telling them, "May you be more fortunate than Augustus and better than Trajan," which kind of tells you everything. Trajan emerged as a kind of paragon of morality, a real role model figure for emperors in the same way that only Augustus did, really. It's kind of an interesting thing that we don't really see Trajan this way. We see him as this cool conqueror. We see Marcus Aurelius filling this role because of the Meditations, but to Roman emperors, they would sooner look to Trajan than Marcus Aurelius as a role model, if I had to guess. Somehow, Trajan also found the time to commission a bunch of buildings. His name was plastered on so many of of them, that Constantine called him the vine upon every wall, no doubt in a spirit of competition, if not envy. And on top of all that, Trajan also chose his successor well. His successor was Hadrian, the next entry on this list. If Trajan was the conqueror, Hadrian was the archetypical traveler. And his inclusion, honestly, it might not be a surprise to you, but it would have come as a shock to the senatorial class, who he locked horns with because he kind of executed a few of them upon his accession to the throne. Somehow his reputation is still well preserved, though. He was anti-expansionist. He was for strong borders, hence Hadrian's Wall. In fact, he was a prolific builder in general. He's the guy behind the Pantheon, behind the Temple of Venus in Roma, the biggest temple in Rome. And he was also a born traveler. He visited every province in the empire. He would fit right into the Carolingian Empire with their frequent circuits around their empire much later. He was also really into Greece, really into the Greek look, that is, the bearded look. He broke with the clean-shaven tradition that went back hundreds of years to Scipio Africanus and wore a beard and made beards cool. And ultimately, as one source says, he goes down as the most remarkable of all Roman emperors, in some ways at least. Also as the intellectual emperor. Ancient writers stressed his restless traveling, his insatiable inquisitiveness, and his complex, many-sided personality. His military and frontier policy, his obsessive generosity to the Greeks, and his ruthless treatment of the Jews were the three elements which had the most long-term impact. Our third and final entry, and this one might surprise you, is Antoninus Pius, the lawmaker. Now again, this is probably surprising. It's not Marcus Aurelius, it's Antoninus Pius, who alongside Nerva is definitely in the bottom rung of fame when it comes to the five good emperors. Marcus Aurelius, Hadrian, Trajan all command way more name recognition. But honestly, while researching this, I just found Antoninus Pius incredibly impressive when it came to his lawmaking program. And I think he is honestly, despite being one of the good emperors, pretty underrated. And it's not too hard to see why. His reign isn't particularly well documented because it wasn't particularly eventful. It's one of the most peaceful reigns in all of Roman history. And, you know, there's a case to be made when things are going well. You don't really need to talk about it. You don't need to write things down. He built the Antonine Wall. This was further north than Hadrian's. It covered like half the distance. So on paper, it was more defensible, but it was built of timber and turf and ultimately abandoned in less than a decade. Antoninus Pius also presided over a treasury surplus, but he did debase the currency for Rome's 900th anniversary games. I think that's understandable. He expanded access to drinking water, but again, most important were his legislative reforms. He sort of codified Roman law. He made sure that local law systems would be more influenced by Roman law. He split the imperial treasury into private and public funds. He was concerned about the well-being of slaves and tried to enact laws that would make sure they would be treated better by their owners. And then perhaps in one of the most precociously modern aspects of his legislative legacy, he advanced the concept of innocence until proven guilty. So again, very precociously modern. As for the philosopher emperor Marcus Aurelius, he is an honorable mention. And I'll quote from Frank McLynn to explain why. I think he puts it best. He wrote that Marcus was largely a failure in politics and government, overwhelmed by circumstances mostly beyond the scope of any human being. Even so, he qualified as the best ever Roman emperor, and to use Shakespeare's phrase, was the noblest Roman of them all. So again, we all like Marcus Aurelius here. He's the most human of all the emperors. By dint of the Meditations, we know more about his mind and what was going on inside of it than any emperor. We have nothing like the Meditations for anybody else. We do have the Gallic Wars from Caesar, but this is a highly embroidered, highly propagandistic account of military campaigns. It's a cherished work of Latin literature, sure, but it is not an autobiography or anything resembling that. Really, the closest thing we have to an autobiography, I think, from any Roman emperor would be the Meditations. And yes, Marcus Aurelius ran around the empire putting out fires. He did his best, but some of those fires were kind of his own making. He was arguably a little bit too good and merciful to those around him who weren't quite deserving of that goodness and mercy. His co-emperor Lucius Verus comes to mind, maybe his wife Faustina as well, and certainly his son Commodus who succeeded him. Marcus Aurelius also contributed to inflation, but this is something almost all emperors are guilty of, so we can cut him some slack there, I think. So why is he only an honorable mention? I mean, for all his soul searching, all his unearthly wisdom, he gives in to that all too human temptation to leave what he accumulated in this life to his flesh and blood. That is to say, he left the empire to Commodus, and Commodus sucked. And with that, ladies, and mostly gentlemen, we come to level 7, the Founders. There are only 2 entries in this level. These are the best of the best, the Optimates of the Optimates. And of course, we're beginning with Augustus. Augustus came up in both of the previous 7 levels videos, so I'm going to go through this quickly. He literally established the template for the Principate period. The base of his power was the accumulation of various titles and honors, his control of the legions, his control of the breadbasket of Rome, which he entrusted to equestrians but never senators, the establishment of the Praetorian Guard too. And as for his legacy, he left Rome a city of marble. He enacted the totally unprecedented grain dole. He expanded the empire, let's not forget, through the annexation of Egypt and by securing the northern border. Thanks Tiberius for helping with that. He also recovered the legionary standards from the Parthians, which had been lost under Crassus. Thanks again, Tiberius, for that. And as a parting note with Augustus, since we've covered him twice already in these 7 levels videos, something more for you to chew on, a hot take if you will, is that he's not the guy you see in Rome HBO. Here's Adrian Goldsworthy to explain why. There was more of Julius Caesar about him than is sometimes appreciated, not least in his ability to extricate himself from scrapes of his own making. Nor is there any real evidence of a long-nurtured plan for creating his new regime. Instead, the picture is one of improvisation and experimentation, creating the system by trial and error, with chance events playing almost as big a role as design. The image of the icy manipulator also quickly vanishes as we look at a man who struggled, and often failed, to restrain his passions and hot temper. This is the Augustus who had an affair with the married and pregnant Livia, made her husband divorce her, and then had the man preside over their wedding mere days after she had given birth. It is an episode you might expect more of Antony, or perhaps even more of Nero, great-grandson of Mark Antony and Augustus' sister. So there you go, that is some glimpse of what lay beneath the mask of the founder of the Roman Empire. This was an image that he cultivated as skillfully as the sculptor of the Augustus of Prima Porta, but it is not an image that Augustus always lived up to. Sometimes he just acted more like Octavian. And our next entry, probably not surprising, Constantine. He is another founder, or even a refounder, let's say, because in some ways he undid the Augustan order. He continued what Diocletian had started. The Tetrarchy didn't last, of course, but the concept of an Eastern Roman Empire did, and Constantine really was the first Byzantine emperor in many ways. Constantine disbands the scheming Praetorian Guard. He founds New Rome, that is Constantinople, and Constantinople would grow very much at the expense of Rome in the grand scheme of things. They would divert the grain going from Egypt originally to Rome, now to Constantinople. Constantinople would grow to a population of about half of Rome at its peak, about 500,000 inhabitants. It had the largest church in Christendom. Really, the only cities that could rival it were in the East, in the Muslim world, and maybe in China and India, but nothing in Christendom, that's for sure. Constantine also enacted various military reforms, economic reforms. He minted the gold solitas to fix inflation, and most important were his religious reforms, of course, kicked off by his battlefield conversion at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge to Christianity. But he was not the guy to actually make it the official state religion. That would come later. Nonetheless, he presided over the Edict of Milan, the return of confiscated church property, the commissioning of Bibles, and the organization of religious councils to settle theological disputes. But like Augustus, he didn't always live up to this image that he tried to cultivate for himself, and he was no saint, that's for sure. And I don't think he went to as great lengths as Augustus did to create this image of himself as better and morally superior to those around him. I don't think he quite pretended to be as much of a moral paragon, but there was this conception of Roman emperors in the late stage Roman Empire as the Lord Stewards on Earth. And that does arguably go back to Constantine. But, at the same time, this was a guy who had his son and his second wife killed because he thought they were sleeping together. So there was that. Anyways, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much to those who made it this far. Another big thanks to those supporting the channel as members or patrons. If you want to see more videos in the 7 levels format, let me know in the comments down below, and I'll see you guys in the next video.